My name is Joyce Gordon, and I'm a volunteer with the Maria Rogers Oral History Program of the Carnegie Branch Library for Local History. It's Sunday, March 24th, 2019, and I'm here with Evan Ravitz, aka Evan from Heaven at North Boulder Park in Boulder, and we're about to watch a sample of the slackline act he performed on the Pearl Street Mall in the late 1970s. We're hoping not to get arrested, as Evan once did on the downtown mall during that time, but we'll talk about that later in the interview. Thanks so much, Evan, for talking with us today about many of the ways that you have contributed to our community.
You're welcome. This isn't going to last long. I haven't tried this apparatus in about 6 years. But I've done some of what the climbers do on the slack line. We're done.
Can you tell us about the equipment that you're using here?
This is a 7/8 inch diameter manila rope, like they used to use on ships before nylon.
And what's the difference between the slack line and the commonly used term tightrope?
So there's every kind of thing. You can have a rope that's much tighter than this. You can have a rope that's much slacker than that. This is kind of in between. And then you can have a tight wire, which is the only thing that ever gets really tight. It just kind of hums. And what's most common that you see in North Boulder Park now is slacklining, which is using a 1 or 2 inch wide nylon web, and that's become popular. I think it started with climbers about 15 years ago, and now there's probably hundreds of people in Boulder who own and use them regularly. So I had a top hat, and other than the first few years of my career, it ended up being like $50 a show. So some nights when there are only a few entertainers, I could do 3 shows, but that only lasted a few years. And there were so many people that often I could only do 1 show a night. But we didn't do it to get rich mostly, but to have fun and travel.
Travel.
Yeah, I ended up going from Alaska to Guatemala.
Did you have an intention of going from Alaska to Guatemala, or did you eke it out step by step?
It kind of happened.
All right, well, I have some more questions about the Downtown Mall Association and all that, but let's relocate to someplace quieter. We are back at Evan's place, and you had mentioned that you had a permit for the mall so that you could climb on the kiosk and get some photos, and I'm wondering what else you needed in order to be an entertainer on the mall, or did that change through the years? What kind of permit did you need?
So when I arrived, there were no permits. Everything was doing well, and eventually they started having permits for special entertainment, which my show was classified as, because I was over 6 feet high and sometimes I juggled fire and blades. And so there were special entertainment permits. Later on, there were personal service permits, like for hair braiding and tarot reading and one-on-one things like that. And of course, there were vendor permits, and I don't think there were any other particular entertainment permits, but I haven't done it in 21 years, so who knows.
Mm-hmm. Did you need insurance?
Yeah, after the permits, I needed liability insurance.
How much did it cost to get your act set up? How much was your overhead between permits and insurance and?
The permit was free, and the insurance, as I remember, was about $80 a year, which is not a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, at first it was several hundred, and then we discovered something called clown insurance, which covered tightrope walking and juggling and was much cheaper. So at first I just I think had some general liability insurance and then clown insurance.
Uh-huh. Did you consider yourself a clown in those days? Was that the overarching category?
No. Those tightrope walkers are more dignified than clowns. But yeah, sometimes we would do clownish things, all of us, I would say. So to some extent, yeah.
Mm-hmm. What was it like? Well, describe the Mall Commission.
So the Mall Commission was established by City Council. It probably had about 5 members. I would say maybe the majority were downtown business people and then interested citizens. And, but, to my mind, they were doing what the downtown business people wanted. And the downtown business people didn't have a clue, because I don't think they expected entertainers to show up on their mall. And the reason I say that is because the city used to have a poster with the mall, of a scene of the mall in the middle and other city parks arranged around the perimeter of the poster. And in the mall part, the only thing happening was white men in gray suits window shopping. And so I think that's what they thought it would be like, just like any other downtown shopping district, but pedestrian. And so I don't think they were ready for us. And some of them, not violently objected, but objected vociferously. Kathy Blackwelder, who owned Thornton's Shoes, said, "We want to curtail the circus atmosphere and prevent a flea market." That's a direct quote. And of course, after a few years, they realized, actually, we want a circus atmosphere, and they have markets, if not flea markets, all the time, probably 4 times a year or so. So they made a big mistake. As I told them, they almost killed the goose that laid their golden egg, and they caused a lot of bad feeling that lasted for maybe the first decade of the mall. And so I think it was Downtown Boulder Incorporated, now known as Downtown Boulder Partnership, that was basically calling the shots, as they claim to do to this day, not just on the mall, but in the city. I talked to one of the board members of Downtown Boulder Partnership, and he said, quote, "Downtown Boulder runs the city." So I think some of them were bigoted against certainly hippies, probably Jews like me. I could tell you why I think that. And young people in general are mistreated in this town. And if you can ask any one of them that grew up here, and they all pretty much know it. I mean, unless they were real nerds off by themselves. If they hung out on the hill, downtown, crossroads, the cops are inexplicably mean, very few warnings given. I could contrast it with Aspen, another tourist town, where the cops are like all psychologically very smart, defuse situations. I've seen cops in this town use violence to start a riot. That was 1988, down on the library lawn. But we're not going to go into that.
All right, well, let's circle back to the downtown issues. And certainly there were times when you butted heads with the powers that be. And can you describe those conflicts, and were they resolved, or how were they resolved?
So the Mall Commission was an advisory body to the city council, and in spite of only having advisory authority, a policeman came up to me probably near the beginning of, I'm going to say July of 1979, and said, the Mall Commission says you can't do your show unless you come and ask permission from them. And so I had to wait a whole month for the next Mall Commission meeting. And they decided to give me the permission. But the next year, the same thing happened. They were a little nicer about it. I only lost maybe a week's worth in 1980. And then they gave me permission again. And then in 1981, there was no problem. And then in 1982, they shut me down. And so they did it 3 times, even though they had no authority to do so. And when my lawyer discovered that in 1983, the city council gave them that licensing authority. And then it took a couple more years before my lawyer was able to show them that the entertainers are good for the mall, and Evan hasn't hurt anybody, and so I've left out, they established a law against tying things to city structures without permission and climbing on city structures. But eventually we came to terms, and in 1985 I started working again. But I lost 3.5 years of work between 1979 and 1984.
What did you do during that time that you weren't working on the Pearl Street Mall?
I did various state fairs and Renaissance fairs, especially because they were out in trees. And I started going in 1984. Late 84, I went to Mexico for the winter and did my show down there in various places, and then Guatemala. And so I was seasonally down there, probably 6, not really winters, they would be 4, 5, 6, 7 months long. So half the time down there and half here through the end of the 80s.
So during that 3-year gap, when it was difficult for you to get, would you say, a permit? It
was not difficult, it was impossible.
It was impossible. Were there other entertainers who were also singled out and not given permits?
Yeah, 2 I can think of. One became world famous. His name is David Shiner, and he became the ringmaster of Le Cirque du Soleil for quite a while, and had his own show on Broadway, and is now one of the most famous mimes on Earth. And another was Leo Grip Ruiz, and performing as, I forget. He ate fire and did magic, and his wife Ginger did what they call the single trapeze or stationary trapeze. You hang by your teeth and by your toes and various ways, and I forget all the things she did. She was kind of a dancer, and they were banned. Someone would just say, "Oh, this looks to me like you need insurance," and they would pick and choose who were, "You don't need insurance, you do need insurance," without anything in law or any like professional risk manager. Just some guy who decides, well, it was probably the Parks and Rec director, Ron Donahue, and then Mike Seacrest. I think they probably made decisions like that by fiat, but eventually it was codified into law. But at first it was just making it up as you go along. And so yeah, myself, David Shiner, Leo, and Ginger were out. I think everyone else, there probably were other people. And certainly there were other people over the years who were harassed in various ways, just by people who worked for the city who didn't know what they were doing, but thought that they had to show discipline of young people or something. Not sure what they were thinking, but the overall feeling is that young people and long-haired and anyone different had to be watched and severely limited. And really, talk to anyone who grew up here as a kid. They all know there's just this punishing attitude of the city of Boulder. So,
what do you think is behind that?
Well, you could go all the way back to, and the city has been talking about this a lot recently. They met with 13 Indian tribes here just last week about trying to make amends for breaking Boulder's treaty with the Indians. Boulder's, like all the other 500 plus treaties, all broken. Boulder is no exception. And when Boulder was established, a building lot cost $1,000, which back in 1850s was a whole lot of money more than normal. In Denver, it was $100 because they intended this to be an exclusive place. And black people all lived in Goss Grove, and especially on what was called Water Street, now known as Canyon Boulevard, which flooded regularly. So if you're a person of color, you live down in the flood zone and don't try to come up on our hill. And so, kind of consonant with that, in the 30s, Boulder was where one of 3 Colorado Ku Klux Klan claverns was located, and there were thousands of KKK members in Boulder. Those people's relatives still live here, and that feeling that this is an exclusive place and we don't want different people here persists to this day. But by now, because of Boulder's liberal reputation, it's very well hidden. But it, believe me, is here, and that's what I think is the original problem. The way I looked at it when I came here is that these were small-town bullies who didn't like newcomers, and especially artists and long hairs and stuff.
I want to get back to the race issue in a little bit, but at one point you were arrested on the mall a couple of times. What were the circumstances?
I think I was arrested for doing my show once. But usually, okay, I remember one time I was arrested by a Sergeant Dilly who lost his job for lying to the chief of police a few years later. And Sergeant Dilly watched me do my entire show and then came up and said, "Evan, in my opinion, those little girls in your front row, you were recklessly endangering them. I'm writing you a ticket." I said, "Officer Dilly, then you are my accomplice because you sat there and watched this dangerous situation for 30 minutes and did nothing." And I have a letter from local attorney Ed Byrne, who back then was the assistant, one of the underlings at the city attorney's office. And he wrote a letter to the police department saying, if you arrest someone for reckless endangerment, you have to stop the endangerment first. So they threw that charge out. The one time I can remember that I was actually taken into custody, handcuffs, it was because a few days before, one of the police had seen me riding my bike on the mall. And so a few days later, he decided to arrest me and take me to jail for it, not just give me a ticket. And he put on the cuffs tightly enough that my wrists bled. And I don't think, I was arrested passively. I don't think the cops do that normally unless they are told to. And so I can only imagine that one of those small town bully downtown business people told the cops, rough them up for us or whatever, which happens thousands of times a day probably in the United States.
Who are the supporters of the mall entertainers? Any business owners that come to mind?
Certainly, Rick, who owned Art Mart, I forget his last name, he let us leave our entertainment gear in his basement, which was very helpful for years, as did others on the mall on occasion. And Virginia Patterson, who, she wasn't on the mall commission, but she was pretty sure she was on the board of Downtown Boulder. And she really talked a lot of sense into them and has always been gracious and nice to me, as are her children and grandchildren that I know.
Yeah, her granddaughter became a very well-known musician with band Paper Bird.
Two of them. I forget their names right now, but maybe they'll come to me. Yeah, they're a talented family.
So eventually you were able to come back and be on the mall.
1985, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And how long did that interval last?
So that lasted until I quit in probably May of 98.
Ah,
So I did get a certain period of time to try to recoup my losses, but as I explained down on the mall, there were a lot more entertainers, and so I wouldn't be able to do 3 shows a night, only 1. So I lost all the would have been the best years in 80 to 85 then, or 79 to 85, when they kept shutting me down. So yeah, I've been poor ever since.
These legal I wanted to ask you about the Boulder. So was it the Boulder County Jail that they took you to? Did you have to stay there any length of time?
Oh, a few hours.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, just a few, maybe 2 hours. And it was like a holding cell when it was 6th and 6th and Canyon there.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't feel too much like a jail at that point. It was maybe like an arraignment, not a real cell, but where you wait when you're being processed or something like that.
Mm-hmm. When did you become involved with the ACLU? Was that as a result of these legal difficulties?
Probably it's related, but it was years later. It was probably in the 90s when I was on the ACLU board.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't, like an immediate thing. I guess it was because I was becoming more political and I met them and they said, why don't you, run for the board or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I forget how it happened.
What sorts of cases were they working with at that time?
So in the early 90s, and the ACLU was involved in some of these. We got 3 new freedoms on the mall. We got those personal service permits for like tarot and massage, chair massage and things like that. And we got permits so that musicians could sell recordings of their music. And we got what the ACLU called free speech tables and the city calls advocacy tables, which basically said, here are, I forget, 3 or 4 per block, places where you can set up a little table, have a sign, give away literature, and collect donations.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone can do that at any time for anything, which is as it should be, since you can go down there and panhandle also. And so, those were the 3 things. And the ACLU was certainly involved, was the main force behind the free speech tables, and I'm pretty sure they helped with the permits for musicians, and maybe the other one too. And we also urged the city to legalize pot or something. I forget what that was about. Something about marijuana.
Mm-hmm. Would you say that the members of the Boulder chapter worked together pretty harmoniously? Were there ever any disputes about how to proceed with a case or an issue?
It was pretty harmonious, except one thing I remember where Mayor Leslie Durgan had stopped someone during the open forum part of the council meeting and told them not to talk about that. And the ACLU, our local group, got the state group involved, and Mayor Durgan apologized. The man got to speak at a subsequent city council meeting and say what he had to say. That was Duncan Campbell. But then later, a typical Boulder weird political thing where the mayor claimed, I wish I had the details in my head straight. I have documents I could track down, but she claimed, I have it on the web actually. evanravitz.com/truth/Durgan. Yep, capital D. That would show it to you, I'm pretty sure. Certainly you could find it, evanravitz.com/truth, and then click on her photograph. at any rate, what I remember was she justified her shutting the person down, and one of the local, I think the local president of the ACLU by then, just kind of wanted to bury it, and we wanted to make a point that you can't apologize and then take it back, which is what the mayor had done. If you want to ask me the question again, let me look at my website and I can get it accurately for you.
Okay.
So there was generally harmonious agreement about most things in the Boulder ACLU, but one little thing came up. In 1993, Mayor Leslie Durgan silenced Duncan Campbell during his 3 minutes of citizen participation at the city council meeting. A few days later, she apologized to Mr. Campbell and he gave his speech. A few months later, the last council meeting before her re-election, Mayor Durgan claims 2 lawyers of the ACLU say she was within her rights to silence Mr. Campbell. Then, a few days later, 3 days later, the Boulder chapter of the ACLU repudiates that claim, and a month later, the Colorado ACLU agrees that no lawyers of the ACLU approved of her silencing Duncan Campbell. And there was some disagreement about whether we should make a big stink of that or not. And that's whatever disagreement was in the local ACLU. So it was over, should we censure Mayor Durgan for claiming that our lawyers approved of her stopping his First Amendment rights? And I think we didn't. This is typical. Just last week, the mayor of Longmont did a U-turn and hit a bicyclist who happened to be a homeless guy. And in the article that I read, it quotes a lawyer saying, I've never heard of a person doing a U-turn and hitting a bicyclist who didn't get cited. But they were the mayor, they hit a homeless person, so no citation. Like I said, it happens every day, thousands of times in America, where people of power and age and stuff get away with all kinds of illegal activities.
Mm-hmm.
Because there are 2 levels of justice, at least. So, yeah, but generally we work together well.
Uh-huh. The Colorado Daily, you wrote for them for a while.
Mm-hmm.
What years were those? What was the name of your column?
It was 1990 to 95, and it started out being called The Tightrope, but that was the editor's choice. I ended up calling it As the Millennium Turns, but it didn't last until the millennium.
And what was that due to?
So I went to a meeting at the university and I made a little speech saying, what's wrong with this university is that it needs to democratize more and listen to its students and listen to its faculty instead of imposing things from the administration. And I said, I identified myself. I said, I'm not part of CU these days, but I write for the Colorado Daily. So this ambitious young reporter for the Colorado Daily, who was also there covering the meeting, which I was not, she told the editor that I had disrupted the meeting and called myself a daily reporter. And one of the 2 professors who called the meeting and ran it Esteban Flores, wrote a letter to the editor saying, no, Evan made a good contribution to our meeting. I didn't think he was disruptive. And Marty Walter, math professor who was at the meeting, he wrote a letter to the editor saying, God, if anyone was disruptive of the meeting, it was me, and I was seconding what Evan was saying. Marty got up, and he's like 6'5", and goes, yes, CU has to democratize. So I had the chancellor of the university, who was there temporarily from California. Oh, I forget his name. His nickname was the Bulldog. And it turned out I didn't trust him, or I would have asked him to weigh in. Later on, I came to know him a little bit. I think he would have told the editor the same thing, that I was not disruptive. And why would I call myself a reporter who, is pretty much told what to do? I was a columnist, could write about anything I wanted every month or so. Why would I call myself a reporter when I wasn't and had no reason to pretend to be? So it was simply false what she told the editor, and I had plenty of evidence that it was false. From two professors, could have had the chancellor, but didn't trust him to ask him to help. And the editor would not meet with me personally. He said, I'll reconsider, but if you don't meet with someone personally, it's like, pro forma, sort of pretending. And I always suspected that he was under pressure to get rid of me because I was a gadfly and, exposing various things at City Hall, etc. So, but I'll never know because he wouldn't give me a second chance. And identifying yourself as a reporter, is just, it doesn't make sense that I would do it since I was a columnist with more freedom.
Mm-hmm. And to the layperson, those two terms are not that different. You reported for the Colorado Daily. You wrote what were some of the things you wrote about?
Well, I wrote about that 13th Street bike path,
mm-hmm.
which is kind of the missing link on the main Broadway north-south bike path of Boulder, and which had been promised years before. And we managed to get that accomplished. And what else? Oh, I wrote about my experiences in Mexico and but mostly local politics. Getting those 3 new freedoms on the mall, I wrote about those. It made it a lot easier to accomplish things that I could get it into print reliably, whatever we were doing.
Would you say that you have been a regular at city council meetings? Do you go to a lot of them?
These days I have been, just very recently, the last 2 meetings. Spoke several times at each meeting on different hearings they were having. But there were many years when I didn't go at all. So yeah, mostly in the early 90s to get those 3 new freedoms and the 13th Street bike path, those 4 things. Then in 2013, got the city to legalize electric bikes on the bike path system. So I was going to meetings then. And then since I got back from Hawaii in 2016, been to city council on behalf of homeless people. And most recently, the city put me on their campaign finance and elections working group, where I got us to get through council and put on the ballot a measure that now is moving forward to allow people to sign ballot initiative and referendum petitions online, which will make it much easier for people without a lot of time to collect signatures in, parking lots and stuff to get their proposals on the ballot.
Uh-huh.
So periodically, 3 times in the last 40 years, I went to a lot of meetings, and in between, I avoided them like the plague.
By the way, I just want to go back and what was the issue that Duncan was talking about that Leslie silenced him on? Do you know? Do you remember?
I don't remember the issue, but I remember he was mentioning a certain person, maybe in city government by name, and the mayor said something like, well, he isn't here to defend himself, so you can't talk about him. And Duncan said, are you shutting me down? You can't do that. He's a lawyer. He knew his rights. And 2 weeks later, with the support of the ACLU, he got to make his speech, and the mayor apologized.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of voting, you're probably most famous for Evan from Heaven, but also Vote by Phone, which was a very big deal. Do you want to tell us the history of that and what happened with that?
And I forgot about that. So yeah, I was at city council meeting a whole lot from 1989, even once in 88, through it appearing on the ballot in 1993. And So people ask me, why would a happy-go-lucky, not-so-tight rope walker endure all the brain damage of going to hundreds of city council meetings and being an activist? And just for a little background, when I was 9, I learned about Indians. I decided that's the way to live. And by age 12, I wrote for English, if we don't become more like the Indians, more cooperative in our ways, we will destroy ourselves. But I didn't know what to do about it so I'm not allowed to perform in Boulder, 1984, and I go to Mexico for the winter, and later on I go to Guatemala, and I just love it down there, and I start building a house on an Indian artist friend's land. And then 3 other Maya friends of mine are shot dead by the Guatemalan army using M16s supplied by the United States government. And I decided to give up building the house there because I don't want to live in a place where my friends are going to die on a regular basis. Came back to Boulder, I was really quite depressed because I intended to stay in Guatemala and be an expat. And now I'm back in Boulder. I read in Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States that by 1975, all the polls show that 2/3 of Americans are opposed to all foreign military aid, which is what killed my friends. And I thought, wow, if that was a real vote, not just a poll, well, my friends would never have been killed, and millions of other people wouldn't have died in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. And, oh, by the way, if there had been a vote on whether I could do my show on the mall, I would never have been kicked out of Boulder because I had a petition of 4,000 people. There was tremendous support for the entertainers. And city council didn't listen to the 4,000, they listened to the downtown business people. So I decided that direct democracy was the solution to all of mankind's problems, and I made a speech in 1988 to council. In 1989 I started organizing, made a database of prominent local people who supported the idea of more direct democracy using voting by phone to make it more practical.
How does that tie in? How does it make it more practical?
Well, it makes elections super cheap because everyone already has a phone. You don't need precincts, you don't need poll watchers, you don't need anything. You just need a computer to answer the phones. And so that would make it easier to have votes on things more often. And so I thought this was like a clever backdoor way of getting more direct democracy by promoting what's also just a convenience for people, voting by phone.
Mm-hmm.
And it was defeated 59 to 41% after a certain amount of fear-mongering by the city council, about security and things like that. And but I think it was really because I was honest that we wanted to use it for direct democracy, and representatives usually see that as a threat to their absolute power. And so, for example, council was unanimously against it, but only one of them was overtly deceitful about it, and that was Council Member Spencer Havlick, who said, so this is back in 1993, remember, it's on the ballot. People are just starting to use their modems and email and stuff, and it's a little difficult with those external modems, and when do you put the receiver down and flick the switch and things like that. And so Spencer says, yeah, I don't want, I have difficulty with my computer and my modem, and I don't want to have this prevent people from voting. But we had made clear this was voting by phone, not voting by computer. And it was as simple as dial the number, press 1 for Bill Clinton and 2 for Bob Dole. It had nothing to do with computers or modems. Spencer Havlick is not a stupid man. He understood perfectly what he was doing. He was trying to confuse and scare people.
Well, it's hard to conjecture what his intentions were, and maybe since he's not here to defend himself, but you got 4,000 people to sign a petition for this. No.
4,000 people to sign a petition for the mall entertainers. But so I started voting by phone mostly because of my Indian friends in Guatemala, but also because of every other kind of unfair, unrepresentative thing that governments do here too, including sending guns down there. So there is a connection, but we never had a petition for voting by phone.
How did you get it on the ballot?
Well, we did have a real petition, a legal ballot initiative petition with almost 7,000 people signed.
Okay, so 7,000 people signed up for this. Very curious among the population, the general population, of, hey, this might be a good idea, and how would this work?
Yep. Yeah, it took some organization to defeat it, but they did it.
And in those days, cell phones were not really popularized anywhere near where they are today. In fact, many people have given up their landlines. So you're thinking vote by phone from a landline, and
well, it could be anything, because you identify yourself with your driver's license, a PIN number, or something. So it wouldn't be that you would have to call from a certain phone.
So in addition to these 7,000 people who got it on the ballot, who were some of the supporters?
Howard Higman was probably the most prominent, and he let us give out our literature at the World Affairs Conference that he founded. And Dr. Bob McFarland. His photograph is up there. He personally collected over 1,000 signatures. And who else? John Collins, who is the president of the American Association of Retired Persons locally here. And there were a bunch of people. Some well-known people supported it, and then after the election of 1992, when Colorado made several mistakes with direct democracy and passed Tabor and the Anti-Gay Rights Amendment 2, for example, Charlie and Jane Butcher, who had endorsed voting by phone, withdrew their endorsement after that election. And probably some other people did too. Oh, the Peace and Justice Center did.
Mm-hmm. Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice.
Mm-hmm. And there were a bunch of organizations that supported it, from the Environmental Center at CU. Who else? I think the ACLU. There were probably, 8 or Sierra Club did. There were probably 8 or more that did. But we're talking 26 years ago.
And I did read in researching this interview that Vote by Phone made it to CNN, CBS, and the Wall Street Journal, but that Channel 8 did not cover it. Don't remember.
I don't know if Channel 8 did or not.
Mm-hmm.
No, we had pretty good coverage. We were certainly in the Denver Post and the Camera and the Daily many times. And so I can't complain that we weren't covered enough or anything.
Well, so after the defeat, what happened with Vote by Phone?
Well, eventually I was convinced that voting by phone, just like voting by computer, is really not secure, because it's secret ballot, which means it's anonymous. And this is very different from doing online financial transactions where your name is on it and as everything is known. When you have anonymity, you can't have both anonymity and security. So I don't believe in voting by phone or computer anymore. Maybe maybe the blockchain changes that. That is for security experts to decide. But I still definitely believe in direct democracy. It doesn't require phones or computers. We've had it in Colorado since 1912.
While I'm thinking about it, off subject, you had mentioned that you have a 40-year yoga practice and your relationship with Richard Freeman. And I've been thinking about this because I read that the yoga workshop is closing maybe in a week or so. So how did you meet Richard, and tell us about the yoga community that you were part of here?
So in 1979, I was living across 13th Street from Beach Park with a bunch of students, and this distinguished yogi named Richard Freeman shows up looking for a place to live, because he then was living in this nasty men's rooming house up on the hill that smelled of urine and was really the cheapest place in town to rent. and he was looking for a better place. And I said, well, I think maybe you don't want to live here with these messy students I'm living with, but move in with my slightly older friends at 541 Arapahoe. And that's what he did. And then in 1980, I moved there. And there were 7 of us there. And Richard taught yoga in his bedroom to 1, 2, 3, or 4 lucky people at a time. And but when he showed up at the house on 13th Street, I knew he was something special. And so I became one of his first students, and he got me to buy this book, Light on Yoga, which is kind of the classic complete text with 500 photographs and about that many postures. And after a year or two, I was doing it for 3 hours a day and making real progress. But, that was probably only lasted a couple of years. And then since then, it's been about an hour a day. But it's been up 40 years now. So, I'm intermediate to advanced yogi, I would say.
And now there's almost as many yoga studios as there are coffee shops in Boulder.
It sure seems
Back
like
in the day, the yoga workshop was unique.
Well, I think there was one in El Dorado Canyon.
Oh yeah, uh-huh.
And
Shoshone, no,
yeah,
maybe
that's what it was called. Shoshone eventually ended up near Rollinsville, but I forget who was where when, but there was at least one established one, I believe in El Dorado then, and there were always other teachers. Boulder had always had yoga teachers.
Mm-hmm.
But Richard was probably one of the first 5 or something.
And one of the favorites.
And Richard, in the world of Ashtanga yoga, which is one of the classical lineages of yoga, Richard's one of the most respected yogis on earth, and also in Boulder.
While we still have a little battery left, I wanted to talk about Zaid Atkinson.
Okay.
And it ties into several of the themes that we've talked about: the police, race, city council.
Yeah.
So for those viewers that don't know the background, can you get us up to speed on that?
Yeah, it must have been about a month ago that Zaid Atkinson, a multiracial, I believe, maybe he's, black, but who is a yoga student at Naropa, yoga major, picking up trash as he did regularly in that student housing area. And apparently I've heard, I haven't really investigated this, some neighbor said he looked out of place. The cops come up. What are you doing? I'm just picking up trash with this grabbing
Grabber.
tool. And they asked to see his ID. He showed his Naropa ID, and they told him to drop the tool. And I think, probably having grown up black, he was sick of being treated like that, and so he didn't drop the tool, and at least one gun was pulled on him, stayed out for minutes. His neighbors started filming it all, and it was just a verbal standoff. But it lasted 10 or 15 minutes until the guns were put away, and I think some Naropa official maybe came and put an end to it. I forget how it ended. But
And we want to also say that when asked for his ID, he presented it
Yeah.
that said he was a student at Naropa.
Yeah. And the neighbor who was made the video is yelling at the cop, "He lives here, he's working here, he's just picking up garbage," you know. And eventually both of them got pissed at the cops and were not polite anymore. But at first, it was just entirely the cops making fools of themselves. And so the city was really embarrassed. The president of Naropa got involved. And this meant, in my opinion, since Naropa is big business in Boulder, the city had a whole evening of, first had this the chief of police explain what happened and be questioned about policy for an hour at one city council meeting, and then a special city council meeting to air all the racist cop and other incidents in Boulder that most of us probably aren't so aware of. And there's they're going to appoint someone to do an official investigation, and hopefully what will come out of it, well, the city is establishing a task force to talk about a community police the police commission. And how much power will it have? Can it give out punishment to police? This is like a constant battle for 30 or 40 years in Boulder. It's how independent are the people who police the police? Right now, they are the police. And they've had commissions that would overlook that, but they didn't really have power. And I don't know all the details, but they're going to have a task force to hash it out to establish a commission to police the police.
You did attend that first city council meeting, though, after the incident.
And the special meeting too, both of them.
Did you speak up at those meetings?
At the first one, not about that, because I didn't know very much about it then. But yeah, at the special meeting I did speak up. And I pointed out some of the things that I told to you, that this goes back to the founding of Boulder as an elitist place, and a place where the KKK was, and a place where downtown businessmen put the kibosh on entertainers because they didn't like hippies. And that it's a continuous thing. It's not like some sudden new problem. It's something that is well hidden because Boulder has its image that it spends a whole lot of money propping up, and only occasion does the facade fall down, as with Zaid Atkinson.
There's so much in social media that is really a time suck and not very enriching, but I was able to view the video of what happened and how the 8 police showed up and drew their weapons, at least one of them did, and all of that. So this kind of takes us back to direct democracy, and how can that theory become a practice, and how can it relate to a situation like this that was so clearly unfair and denied a citizen of his rights?
Well, I'm not sure it connects directly to racism, but we already have direct democracy since 1912 in Colorado and in Boulder for maybe the same length of time. And it's been incredibly successful both in Boulder and even more so on the state level. To give, the best examples, in Boulder, in 1967, we voted in the first taxpayer-approved open space program in the country. And now we have, the best open space in the country, maybe. And we did that by ballot initiative. The city council did not do it, although they followed through and kept at it. And in 1977, I believe it was, we passed the first gay rights law in the country by ballot initiative. And we also instituted publicly financed political campaigns in 1999, and there's been a bunch of them. Keeping housing below the 5,800-foot level, so-called blue line, the height limitations, keep things to, depending on the location, 30-something to 55 feet. Nothing higher without a special
permit.
deal. Yeah, which they gave out like candy a
Yes,
few years ago, unfortunately.
for a price.
So that's in Boulder, and then in Colorado we have an incredible record of ballot initiatives. See how many I can remember. There's 16 of them in the last 9 election cycles. The year 2000, we passed Amendment 20 for medical marijuana, 22 closing the gun show loophole, and 23 increasing school spending by 10%. In 2002, we passed Amendment 27, one of the country's strongest campaign finance reforms. In 2004, we passed Amendment Initiative 37, which is the country's first renewable energy mandate. In 2006, we passed Amendment 41, considered the country's strongest limitations on lobbyists. Can't give any gifts to politicians. In 2008, we passed Amendment 54, which prevents large government contractors from contributing to political campaigns. In 2012, we passed Amendment 61, 64, country's first legal marijuana and hemp. In 2016, we passed Amendment 70, increasing the minimum wage to $12 an hour. And then just this last 2018 election, we passed Amendments X and Y, which are 2 ways to stop gerrymandering for our federal reps and our local reps. And Proposition 111, I think it was, which restricts payday loan interest rates. And I've left out a couple of others, but that's probably 14 of the 16.
Well, and that's within the state of Colorado.
Yeah.
But our minimum wage is not $12 an hour.
Right. They're phasing it in.
Ah.
So maybe in another 3 or 4
Couple of
years.
decades.
So maybe it's up to 10 or 11-ish now.
But since this interview is being done for a local history, I think it behooves us to say that for the state of Colorado, we have local Jared Polis just won the governorship. So will it be a new day for Colorado? You did some
certainly.
research for him.
I did some research. He owns Aquacopia, or he's a major investor in Aquacopia, which does deep sea fish farming. And he wanted to know if there was a money-making way to take whatever's in the ocean, presumably seaweed, and turn it into fuel. And I said, no, this is a good way to lose money. And nothing ever came of it. And to my knowledge, there are no ocean to fuel projects that are really happening anywhere in the world 12 years later. So,
But he is acting as an entrepreneur. He's got that spirit and looking for ways to make things happen.
Yeah, no, I think he's a big improvement over John Hickenlooper, but that's not saying much. I think Hickenlooper is a joke as a presidential.
There's another issue that I know is very important to you, and that is the online petition. Can you give us an idea of the history of that and where it stands now?
Yeah. So, ballot initiatives, I gave you a whole list of them, are what made Colorado and Boulder great. And they're very difficult to do. You have to collect thousands of signatures, and this has always been a problem, but it becomes more and more of a problem as public spaces become privatized and people don't let you pass petitions there anymore. So I learned that in Switzerland, they never required petition passers to hand you a petition. So petitions are just left out at stores and offices for people to sign. And that's why it's so hard here, is because you have to have someone witness it, like this is some, potentially dangerous act that has to be documented. Did they sign the petition or not? And in Switzerland, they never required that. And they've had online petitioning at wecollect.ch. And so it's trivial to sign a petition in Switzerland. It's a big deal here. You have to find the text online and read it, and then you have to go down and hope that you'll run into a petitioner at some event or in front of some supermarket or something. And so most people don't read the petition because the person at the supermarket says, oh, this just gets it on the ballot and you can read up on it later. So online petitioning has worked in Switzerland for years. It's used in Arizona, not for initiative petitions, but for candidate petitions. But it's the same thing. You identify yourself and you say, yeah. And so starting a few years ago, I started talking about it, and Jared Polis was kind of interested, and this group of ours that promotes direct democracy in Colorado. And then in 2017, issue 2Q appeared on the Boulder ballot, and the city attorney told council, and council told the people this was just a charter cleanup, get rid of obsolete things, tidy up, combine parts. And it wasn't. It was a mess up of our ballot initiative process. And myself, former Councilman Steve Pomerantz, and other people hit the roof. And council came as close as I've ever seen them to admitting they made a mistake, and they appointed this campaign finance and elections working group. And Steve Pomerantz and myself and a bunch of recent city council candidates and a lawyer from League of Women Voters and just a wide variety of people. Our 11 of us were on the group, and I told them that, we can fix our initiative process, that 2Q is just messed up, but we can make it much better by allowing petitioning online, and convinced all 11 members to endorse that. We convinced City Council to put it on the ballot unanimously, and the people passed it 71 to 29% last November. But what we passed allowed Council to take one of two options, or both. Real online petitions, which anyone can sign anywhere from any device in the world 24/7, all that convenience, or what they're calling electronic petitioning, which is a system where you still have to have petition passers, but they hand you an iPad instead of a piece of paper, and it has a few advantages, but not nearly as many as online petitioning. And it looked like council was going to do that, but fortunately, 3 weeks ago now, February 19th, they decided to go with what the people wanted. We were never enthused about the electronic petitioning, but we put it on as an option. They went with the real thing. And lo and behold, a couple of months ago, a national nonprofit called maplight.org offered the City of Boulder a free, ready-to-go, true online petitioning system using open source software, which means once we have it working here, it's free for any other city or state to use. And this will bring ballot initiatives within the range of regular people who don't have a lot of money to hire petitioners or a huge organization like the Sierra Club or something. And we'll become more like Switzerland, where they vote 4 times a year on national, state, and local ballot issues. And it is arguably the only country in the world that really has government by the people on a regular basis on all the levels of government.
And now I've signed many petitions just to get an issue on the ballot, and it seems to be really important that you're a registered voter. Now, will this be another instance of you have to be a registered voter in order to sign an online petition, or will that change?
Yeah, it uses the same database that the Secretary of State has of registered voters. And once you've identified yourself with your, usually it's your driver's license, but maybe a military or other state ID, then just like you can register to vote just by giving your driver's license, you should be able to sign a petition just by giving your driver's license. And this is a way better form of identification than a signature, which changes over time. They don't have like professional graphologists look at these things, in a legal way. It's a very, crude way of identifying people.
And a fairly substantial percentage of signers are either not registered, they don't live in Boulder County, or whatever else needs to happen in order for their signature to count.
Right. So this will mean that 100% of signatures will count, because you have to get through the identification process, not just the driver's license, but also that you live in the right town to sign just the town petition. And so it's better in every way. It allows people to change their minds and remove you're not really ever making a signature, you're just clicking a box saying, I approve of this petition and this, but not this and this. And then you can change your mind later, as long as it's before the deadline for signatures, and say, oh, my mistake, I don't want to sign that one. And you can refer back to make sure that things were recorded properly. Just like you can go, when people were worried that people were getting disenrolled from having their registration taken away, in 2016, there were a bunch of places, especially Brooklyn, Bernie Sanders' place, where people were getting disenrolled from the voters. And so people want to go and check their registration. Well, you can go and check that your initiatives, that you clicked on the right ones, and that record is correct as well. And saves the Secretary of State or maybe the city clerk the cost of hiring people to compare signatures, because the computer is IDing you by your driver's license.
In the last election, I was able to sign up for a notification that my ballot had been received, and that's important.
Yep. Yeah, these things are trivial with computers. think of, almost everything in government has been done by computers for decades, except ballot initiative petitions, because that's government by the people, and representatives and the people who control them, the people with the money, don't like it when the people take control directly. And that's why we haven't had it, even though we could have 20 or more years ago. But better late than never, and it'll bring direct democracy into the 21st century, finally.
Must be really satisfying to see these kinds of advances.
This one was a big one, and it took a whole year to get it done. So yeah, I'm glad. I hope it can. I hope it goes smoothly from here. The last year has not been smooth, but I won't go into detail.
Anything else that we should be talking about in this interview?
Probably, but we can go back and do it again another
All
time.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
And it's been a really pleasure talking with you
Thank
today.
you too. You certainly did your homework.